Hello, Year 8. Welcome to this lesson about prejudice and discrimination, part of your prejudice and discrimination module. And today we're talking about Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. This is a wicked topic. I love this topic. Martin Luther King, man. Such a legend. Obviously, he did not do the whole civil rights movement by himself. He was one of 6 main leaders in the NAACP, the North American African Congress Party. Oh, I've forgotten that. That's what the organisation was called anyway, the NAACP. And we're talking about Martin Luther King's dream. We're going to talk about what was the civil rights movement, who was Martin Luther King, why was Martin's approach so powerful, and where did Martin Luther King get his inspiration. So you're doing a booklet, you're doing another chapter on your booklet called Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. You might hear some people online talk about MLK. When they say MLK, they mean Martin Luther King. Oh, it's well exciting. And this is really important to look at when we're looking at prejudice and discrimination, because Martin's and the whole civil rights movement, the NAACP's sort of take on how to bring around social change, was something that the world had not seen before in terms of the scale of its organisation, but also in the zeal, in like the philosophy of the movement. Really, really cool. So, first question, what was the civil rights movement? I hope you like my glasses, by the way. They are blue light glasses because I'm spending a lot of time these days looking at computer screens, so I'm trying to protect the poor little eyes. What was the civil rights movement? Some basic facts for us. Who, what, when, where, how, and why. So, who? That was people who believed that all races should be treated equally. I mean, it was mainly organised by people of colour, mainly Afro-Caribbean people, people of African descent. Yeah, whose ancestors had been slaves in the US before slavery started. People like Martin Luther King. So what was it? It was a decades-long struggle by African Americans to end legalised racial discrimination. That's really important, that racial discrimination was legal. Disenfranchisement and racial segregation in the United States. Disenfranchisement. What does that mean? I mean, you could look it up on Google, couldn't you? You could just type it in and it will tell you. Disenfranchisement means to be disempowered, to not have power, to not have any place in society. That you don't have any of the franchise of American society. And segregation means to live separately. So there were lots of laws that said white people and black people should live separately. And this was sort of between 1954 and 1968 that this was taking place. And this was when you've probably seen those photos of blacks only, whites only, water fountains and stuff like that. And they were campaigning against segregation of that, of schools, of universities, of swimming pools, of park benches, of public toilets. Segregated society. So this was in the USA. How? Well, that's kind of a really exciting question for me. I love that question. How did they manage to pull this off? Through non-violent civil disobedience. Disobedience. Not obeying what people told them to do. Marches, protests, sit-ins, boycotts, and political pressure. So it's really interesting when you start looking at the theory of social change and why and how society changes. And the civil rights movement got really good at putting pressure, unbearable pressure, on the political power that existed in order to bring around social change. Very good at it. And the big question, of course, in beliefs and values that we're always talking about is why? Why did they do it like this? And why did it happen? Well, we've got to remember the context to answer that question. First of all, these are pictures of the Ku Klux Klan, which was a racist group of white people who thought that white and black people should live separately and that white people were superior to black people. And you can see there on that bottom left photo, that's a picture of a lynching. You can't quite see in this photo, but when that's a high definition photo, you can see these people in the front there smiling, and the people in the back have been hung. They've been beaten to death and hung by a group of white racists. And that is a lynching, where a mob gets together and they lynch someone to death, torture them to death, and then hang them publicly as a sort of spectacle. We have to remember this is the context that the civil rights movement is working in. They are fighting for equality in that horrendous, unspeakable violence. And as a result of that, things like Martin Luther King's house gets bombed. It's a picture of his house after it got bombed. It was bombed while he was preaching, and his wife and his 2 kids were in the house. Amazing story, actually. So he was preaching, and Ralph Abernathy, who was sort of his right-hand man, came up to him and said, "Martin, your house has been bombed." And he acknowledged it and was like, "Okay, I'll just turn off my speaker." And he went there, and by the time he got there, there was like a mob of people of colour, of black people outside his house, angry, that his house had been bombed, and there were white police there who weren't really doing anything about it. And the police were telling the crowd to go home and calm down, and the police had guns, and the crowd had guns, and they were really angry that the police weren't finding out who these people were and doing anything about it. And you can just, one of the most amazing things about the civil rights movement is that it would be really reasonable to expect a civil war after slavery and all of the oppression that black people had been through. And some black people who wanted equality did indeed actively take up weapons against the police. And Martin said, "What we need now is peace. Go home, calm down." And our house has just been bombed, and he managed to calm a mob. He managed to calm a mob even after his house had just been bombed. Really unusual human being. You've got to remember the story of people like Emmett Till. I won't go into this in too much detail because you'll do this in history, but this was a 14-year-old African American who was lynched. This kid was tortured to death after just a white woman accused him of flirting with her. Just accuse him. That was enough to have him beaten to death and his body thrown into a river. Oof. I might get a bit tearful in some of this. I'm sorry. I'm not sorry, but it's always weird to see a teacher cry, isn't it? And this is a map of the slaves, of where the slaves mainly lived in America in the late 19th century. So the darker red, more than 50% of the population are slaves. 10 to 50% orange, less than 10% yellow. So there's a massive, massive population of slaves in the United States. And people have been conditioned in those times to think of black people as objects to be traded. So we talked a bit last lesson, hopefully you watched it, about the slave trade, about how manufactured goods went to Africa, slaves went to North America, and then tobacco, cotton and sugar went back to Europe from America and Africa and the Caribbean islands. And people were crammed, human beings crammed into boats. And this image for me sums up the horror of slavery. Oof, it's a terrifying image. It's how people were stacked. Maximise storage space to maximise profit. And that white people had taught themselves for hundreds of years that this was an acceptable way to behave. This was not even acceptable, this was a noble, this was something to aspire to own slaves and be rich. And you could see that even in the advert at the times of the 50s. There's still existing even hundreds of years after slavery had become officially illegal. You can still see black people portrayed as dirty or uncivilized or as a serving class for white people. And even just recently in the Black Lives Matter movement, there was the Uncle Ben's rice. This is this black guy picking rice on the front of that. They acknowledged, this is okay, this is a racial stereotype. Let's get rid of this. So this is a context that the civil rights movement is working in. We've got pictures of segregated buses here. You can just see on the top of that picture, this part of the bus is for people of the coloured race. And this woman, who you probably know who she is, her name is Rosa Parks, who sat down on a white person's seat or on a seat, and when she was told to move by a white person, she refused. With 2 other people, by the way, whose names have been lost. I mean, they haven't been lost, you can find them, but they're not told in the stories. Rosa Parks became sort of the figurehead for this non-violent civil disobedience. She was very polite. She didn't swear at anyone. She didn't hit anyone. She just sat down and refused to move. Non-violent civil disobedience. And after that, there was a massive boycott of the buses, and then the buses stopped being segregated after 21 months, I think it was, if I remember correctly. Might have been 19 months. Oof. A long time. It's like more than a year and a half at least, of people refusing to ride the buses, organising themselves, giving each other car shares, some people walking 10 miles to work, 10 miles back, just to avoid riding racist buses. And eventually the buses lost their money, and they were like, well, if we don't let black people sit wherever they want, we're going to go bust. So they let black people ride wherever they wanted. Massive victory. And the civil rights movement was great at this, persevering in non-violent civil disobedience. Absolutely phenomenal. When people would have to remind people in positions of power that they were indeed human beings, because they for so long had been treated as less than human beings. And the black community got just so phenomenally organised. Got to mention this as part of the context, which is the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, which killed 4 girls and injured between 14 and 22 other people. Those girls, 3 of them were 14 and 1 of them was 11. The FBI concluded in 1965 that bombing had been committed by 4 known Klansmen, and no prosecutions were conducted until 1977, 14 years later. Now, I mean, there's just words leave me about this. It's important to say their names, I think. Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Carol Dennis McNair. 4 young girls who were killed when a group of white guys put dynamite next to a church and blew it up. And still, the civil rights movement maintained a discipline to non-violence. That would be tough, right? People bombing your house, people bombing your community, killing your children, and people still committing to non-violence. If you get a chance to watch the movie Selma, which you can buy on YouTube, or get it streamed on all sorts of things, Selma is just an absolutely brilliant film which sums up civil disobedience and the civil rights struggle. This guy, Medgar Evers. Got to talk about Medgar Evers. He was a civil rights campaigner. Was also killed before he was 40. Brutally murdered and lynched by a mob. So these people who try to organise for equality, faced very real death threats. And you can understand that this is a very understandable reaction to racism. So Malcolm X, who died when he was 39 as well, before Martin Luther King was assassinated. And here are pictures of the Black Panthers as well, who came later, who, said we should get freedom by any means necessary, like, even if it means we need to be violent. And that's understandable, isn't it? I mean, in the face of that sort of level of violence and persecution, it's quite reasonable, I think, to become violent. I mean, to try and defend yourself. So, let's look a bit more at Martin Luther King. Who was he? Why was Martin's approach so powerful? And what inspired him? So the first one, who was he? Quick fact file. Born in 1929 in Atlanta. He was the son of a Baptist, which is a kind of Christian preacher. So the only one who could ever reach me was the son of a preacher man. Some people say that's about Martin Luther King. He became a preacher himself. He visited India and drew inspiration from Gandhi's methods of non-violent civil disobedience, which we will look at next time. In 1964, he received a Nobel Peace Prize in recognition for his work for racial equality. He's the youngest person to ever receive that award. At that time, Malala Yousafzai is now the youngest person, who we will also look at in this module. How exciting. He helped win the vote for black people in America. He was one of 6 main leaders of the civil rights movement. I thought it was important to have that photo there, that Martin Luther King was not the only person organising this civil disobedience. Medgar Evers was one of those 6 people. Inspired countless millions in social movement all across the world. And continues to do so, even people like me. So you can be adding some of those fact file things to your booklet. As I'm going, you might want to stop and be like, oof, that's important, we need to include that. Yes. I'm going to leave that up to you, to your creative license. Why was his approach so powerful? I've decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. Non-violence means avoiding not only external physical violence, but also internal violence of spirit. You not only refuse to shoot a man, but you refuse to hate him. This is like next level now, what we're talking about. This is not just about political or social change. This is about a strength of spirit, a strength of character, of refusing to hate. Even when people bomb your house with your family inside, even when people kill the children of your community, still refusing to hate and choosing love. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. There's something very powerful. Something very powerful in this method, in this teaching. Maybe you can feel it, maybe you feel it stirring in you, this sort of commitment to non-violence, or not just in action, but in word and in thought. I'm going to play you some of his speeches because I can't do it justice. If you listen to him speak, it's just it's phenomenal. It's phenomenal. I'll show you. It's worth reading this out. Are we seeking power for power's sake? Or are we seeking to make the world and our nation better places to live? If we seek the latter, violence can never provide the answer. The ultimate weakness of violence is a descending spiral, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. Through violence, you may murder the liar, but you cannot murder the lie, nor establish the truth. Through violence, you may murder the hater, but you do not murder hate. In fact, violence merely increases hate, and so it goes. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Strong, strong stuff. So, Martin's method was about transforming his opponents. That's what really made his method so powerful, is it wasn't about proving them wrong or destroying them. It was about finding ways to change their minds and their hearts, to help them see why this was such an important issue. And of course, many of you will have heard Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So that's the beginning of the American Constitution. So Martin Luther King's combining his spirituality and his faith with politics and with his deep understanding of the national identity of the American people, that all men are created equal, written on the American Constitution but not lived out. And Martin Luther King had to fight for that to become the reality, as did everyone else in the civil rights movement. So what inspired him? Well, his faith. So Jesus said, love your enemies, bless those who curse you. If someone strikes you on one cheek, then turn the other cheek also. This was something Gandhi really took to heart. He really took that seriously. And as I say, Martin took great inspiration from Jesus saying that. And he said about himself, "They won't let me live to see 40." He wrote that in a paper when he was at university, because he said the changes that he wanted to bring to society were so radical that society would not manage to let him survive it. It would have to destroy him. So I'm going to play you maybe what I think is the most powerful 3 minutes on the internet, because this is the last speech he ever gave, and he was assassinated the next morning, shot through the neck, out through the back of his head, while he was on the balcony of a hotel. A man on the street shot him, and he was 39 years old. So I'm going to play you this video. Oh, gonna sneeze. Bless me. And I hope you get something of that sense of his power.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Strong stuff, right? Strong stuff. Like anyone, I'd like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. I'm not worried about that now. I just want to do God's will. I don't know what will happen now. And he shot the next morning. Really something spooky about it. So this language that he uses, it's important to look at that. This thing about the promised land, and I've gone up to the mountain, and I've seen the promised land. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. This is... Martin Luther King regularly quotes straight from the Bible in his speeches. He uses, "And the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all flesh will see it together." he uses loads of quotes like this. He's combining that sort of Baptist preacher background with this political activist, this social organizer. To the extent that, I'm going to play you one more video, we now see things like this happening in the White House. And of course, Barack Obama, very much from the same tradition of community organizing in lots of ways. The community organizing movement in America was where Barack Obama started. And also, you know, the work of Martin Luther King made it possible for Barack Obama to be a president. And what he started to do is he used to have live music.
In 1962, in my hometown, we were engaged in a very intense struggle against racial segregation. And there were mass jailings. At one point, a federal judge issued an injunction with names on it of the people they thought were the leaders of the movement. Reverend Samuel Wells was in Shiloh Baptist Church that night, and he said, "I'm not going to let no injunction turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round." Wait, I know this is a show, but you have to actually sing this song. You can never tell when you might need it. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let no injunction turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let no injunction turn me round. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let no jailhouse turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let no jailhouse turn me round. I'm gonna keep on walking, yeah, keep on talking, yeah, marching up to freedom land. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me round. I'm gonna keep on walking, yeah, keep on talking, marching up to freedom
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
So I think you agree that's definitely progress from what Martin Luther King was dealing with. It's really cool, right, to see those singers. And gospel music played a massive part of the civil rights movement that we haven't really had time to go into today. But do ask your music teachers to go into it, or look up some YouTube videos. And hopefully, if you just put songs of the civil rights movement into YouTube, you'll find some really great stuff. So hopefully you should be able to answer those 4 things on the chapter of your booklet. What was the civil rights movement? Who was Martin Luther King? Why was his approach so powerful? And where did Martin Luther King get his inspiration? Just briefly, I did my master's degree about Martin Luther King, so I know you can write a lot about it, but just see if you can show me that you can just summarise those things. That would be great. And I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and oh, I've got some extension tasks for you too. So here is a bit of extension work, if you would like, for you able and talented students, which lots of you are, which is make some positive content about your dream or your promised land. Martin Luther King famously said, "I have a dream that one day my children will not be judged by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character." So what would your dream be like? What would you like to change in the world? We've still got a lot of problems in the world. This is a world map of slavery today, which still exists. Estimated 30 million people still in slavery. It's illegal, but still happens. Massive problem, especially in India and China, Pakistan. Maybe that's something that you would like to talk about in your promised land, in your dream world. Well, this is a graph showing wealth inequality. So down here you can see that 20% of the people have just a tiny proportion of the wealth. Even the bottom half don't have that much money. In fact, even if you put the 70%, if you put all of this together, it would still be less than the top 1% of the population. You get some people who are super rich, and some people who cannot even afford to feed themselves. 2.2% of the population has zero or negative wealth, which means they're in debt. Maybe that's something you'd like to address in your dream. Or maybe the environmental and biodiversity crisis we are currently in. As you may know, we are in the midst of a 6th mass extinction. It's not very chirpy, this stuff, but it's important to draw inspiration from movements like the civil rights movement to be like, well, if they could change that, we can change this. There's a bit more information there if you want to pause the video and have a read through if this particularly appeals to you. Or perhaps it could be about the rights of people to express their sexuality. In those countries marked black, you can get the death penalty for being found to be gay. Some people aren't gay, they're accused of it, and still they lose their lives, sometimes in horrific ways. And here's another extension, if you don't like the sound of that one, but you would like to do something, which is to write your opinion about whether you think violence or non-violence is the better way to achieve social change, or do you need both? Do you need the violent people to make people be like, oh my god, this is really serious, we need to do something about this, and the non-violent people to be the people who you invite to sit down at the table and conversate to talk with you about solutions, and just giving reasons for your opinions. And you can try and include quotes or examples in your answer, please, that would be great. Couple of able and talented exercises for you there if you feel like doing a bit more on this inspiring topic. Thanks, bye.